I walked into the courthouse with cameras flashing so hard it felt like lightning striking my face. People whispered my name the way you whisper about a woman who has already lost. Not curious, not kind, final. I wasn't there because I had failed. I was there because my father wanted the city to believe I had. The marble floor echoed under my heels as if the building itself was announcing me. Bankruptcy court, federal, public, the kind of room where reputations don't just crack, they shatter. My lawyer leaned close and murmured that everything was on schedule. Her voice calm, measured. She didn't need to explain what that meant. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about law. This was a public execution carefully staged with my own family holding the script. Across the room, my father sat upright, shoulders squared, gray hair perfect, wearing the expression of a man burdened by disappointment. He looked like the victim of a daughter who had embarrassed him beyond repair. Beside him sat my younger sister, hands folded in her lap, posture effortless, eyes serene. She didn't look at me at first. She didn't have to. I could feel her certainty like a hand pressed flat against my back. She smiled once, just enough. The kind of smile that says this ends today. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Chairs scraped, breath caught. Everyone expected the same outcome. Everyone except me. Because what no one in that courtroom knew, what I had hidden for 9 years, was that this hearing was the worst place they could have dragged me. And when the judge opened the file and paused longer than expected, I knew something had already shifted. I took my seat and folded my hands the way I had taught myself to do years ago when showing emotion became a liability. From the outside, I probably looked resigned, maybe even broken. That was the version they had sold, the irresponsible daughter. The financial risk. The one who couldn't be trusted with her own life, let alone anything connected to the family name. My sister finally turned and met my eyes. Her expression softened, perfectly calibrated for the room. Concerned. Sad. The good daughter watching her troubled sister face consequences. She had practiced that look for years. I knew because I had watched it work on teachers, on advisors, on anyone with authority. It wasn't cruelty that made her dangerous. It was restraint. My father cleared his throat, a small sound that used to mean he was about to speak for both of us. When we were younger, he had done it at dinner parties, at school meetings, at every moment I tried to explain myself. "Don't worry, I've got this," his tone always implied. What it really meant was, let me decide how this story is told. I didn't look at him now. I looked straight ahead at the seal on the wall behind the bench, at the words about justice engraved in stone. For years, I had believed that if I worked quietly enough, built carefully enough, stayed out of the spotlight, I would be safe. That distance would protect me. I had been wrong about the protection. I had not been wrong about the preparation. The judge adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the file again. He didn't speak right away. He read, slowly. His expression didn't change, but the pause stretched just long enough to unsettle the rhythm of the room. My sister shifted in her seat, barely perceptible. My father's jaw tightened. I thought briefly of all the times I had been told to let things go. Be the bigger person. Don't make trouble. Family is family. Those words had trained me well. They had taught me how to absorb damage without flinching, how to keep my voice steady when mine was the only one shaking. They had also taught my sister something else entirely. That silence could be shaped. That narratives could be controlled. The clerk called the case. My name sounded different in that room. Smaller. Official. Stripped of history. I answered when prompted, my voice, even my back straight. I didn't look toward the gallery. I didn't need to see the faces to know what they reflected back. As the opening statements began, I listened without reacting. The language was clinical concerned, laced with phrases like fiduciary responsibility and risk mitigation. My father's attorney spoke as if this were a regrettable necessity, a step taken only after every private option had failed. He painted a picture of urgency, of protection of a family forced into the public eye by my alleged instability. My sister nodded at the right moments. She never spoke. She never needed to. When it was our turn, my lawyer stood and spoke briefly, carefully. No fireworks, no denials shouted into the void. Just a request for the court to consider the facts in full, to look beyond appearances, to take its time. The judge listened. He asked a few procedural questions. Routine, predictable. The room relaxed slightly, settling back into its expectations. This was how it was supposed to go. Slow, technical, inevitable. Then the judge stopped, flipped a page, and frowned. He looked up directly at my sister for the first time, then back at the documents in front of him. He tapped one page with his pen once. The sound cut through the room like a snapped thread. Before we proceed, he said, his voice neutral but firm. I need clarification on one point. My sister's smile froze just for a fraction of a second. The judge leaned forward. On this filing, the assumption is made that the respondent had full authority over the asset in question during the period cited. Can you explain how that aligns with the amendment dated? He stopped, looked again, then continued. With the amendment dated 9 years ago, the air changed. I felt it before I saw it. My father went very still, as if his body had forgotten how to breathe. My sister's eyes flicked not to me but to her lawyer. He didn't move, didn't object, didn't interrupt. I lowered my gaze not out of shame but to hide the smallest curve of relief forming in my chest. Not satisfaction, not victory, recognition. For 9 years I had kept that amendment quiet, structured, buried under layers of compliance and distance. Not because I was afraid, because I understood exactly how my family handled threats. The judge looked up again, waiting for an answer. And for the first time since I walked into that courtroom, I knew they no longer controlled the story. The sound of paper sliding across the counsel table pulled me out of the courtroom and into a memory I hadn't visited in years. It was the same sound my father used to make when he straightened documents before speaking a quiet signal that whatever came next would not be a discussion. It would be a decision. I learned early that our family didn't run on affection. It ran on order, on appearances, on the unspoken understanding that what mattered most was how things looked from the outside. My father was admired in our town, the kind of man people trusted instinctively. He spoke carefully, dressed conservatively, and never raised his voice in public. At home, he wasn't cruel. He was distant, which I learned much later can do just as much damage. My mother smoothed over everything. She believed deeply in harmony, even if it meant swallowing truth. If my father represented authority, my mother represented endurance. She avoided conflict the way some people avoid illness, convinced that acknowledging it would make it worse. When tension rose, she would smile and say, "Let's not make this a bigger deal than it needs to be." I heard that sentence so often it became background noise. My sister fit perfectly into that system. From the moment she could speak, she knew how to perform. She listened, watched, adjusted. Teachers loved her. Neighbors praised her. She had a gift for making people feel reassured just by standing near them. When she did well, it was celebrated. When she struggled, it was protected. She was seen as delicate, promising someone the world might damage if we weren't careful. I was given a different role. I was strong, independent, the one who could handle things. It sounded like praise, and for a long time I believed it was. Only later did I understand what it really meant. If I was strong, I didn't need help. If I didn't need help, I didn't need attention. If I didn't need attention, I could be overlooked without guilt. That difference shaped everything. When my sister brought home accomplishments, my father spoke proudly about her future. When I did the same, he nodded and asked what my next step was. When my sister made a mistake, it was explained away. When I did, it became a lesson. I learned to absorb disappointment quietly. I learned that questioning decisions made me difficult. I learned that staying silent made life easier for everyone else. There was one moment years ago that marked the shift I wouldn't recognize until much later. We were all gathered in the living room discussing a decision that would affect all of us. I spoke up calmly, offering an alternative. It wasn't an argument, it was a suggestion. My father looked at me surprised, then corrected me in front of everyone, not harshly, just firmly enough to shut the door. My sister didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She watched, waiting, then gently agreed with my father. She framed it as support as unity. The room relaxed instantly. I felt the weight of it settle on my chest, that familiar sensation of having stepped out of line without realizing it. After that, I stopped offering alternatives. Not because I agreed, but because I understood the cost. Speaking up didn't change outcomes. It only changed how I was seen. Over time, I withdrew emotionally. I focused on my own path, my own work, my own life. I told myself distance was maturity. In some ways it was. In others, it was survival. The courtroom came back into focus as my sister crossed her legs, smoothing the fabric of her skirt. She looked composed, confident, exactly as she always had. I watched her and realized something I hadn't fully admitted before. She hadn't just benefited from our family dynamic. She had studied it. She had learned when to speak, when to stay silent, how to let other people do the damage while she appeared blameless. My father glanced toward her now, just briefly. It was the same look he used to give her when she was younger, the unspoken check-in. Are we aligned? She gave the smallest nod. Reassurance delivered. Authority confirmed. I thought about how many times I had been told I was imagining things, reading too much into situations, taking things personally. Those phrases had trained me to doubt my instincts. They had also trained my sister to trust hers completely. The judge shifted in his seat and the memory faded, but the clarity remained. This courtroom wasn't the beginning of my family's betrayal. It was simply the first time it had been exposed to people who didn't owe us loyalty. For years, everything had happened behind closed doors, wrapped in civility and concern. Now the same patterns were playing out under fluorescent lights, with a record being kept. I caught my sister watching me again, her expression soft, almost sympathetic. If someone didn't know us, they might believe she was worried about me, that she hated being part of this. I knew better. That look wasn't concern. It was confidence. As the proceedings moved forward, I noticed something small, but unsettling. A phrase used in a filing. One I had heard before years earlier in a private conversation that was never meant to leave the family. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was familiar enough to make my pulse steady instead of race. I realized then that this case hadn't been thrown together in a moment of panic. It had been planned, shaped, refined. The same way our family had always shaped stories to fit what the world expected to see. I sat back in my chair and took a slow breath. Whatever happened next, I understood one thing clearly. I hadn't lost my place in this family recently. I had been losing it my entire life. And the only difference now was that I finally saw it for what it was. It took me a long time to understand that my sister didn't simply thrive in our family's system. She learned how to operate it. At first, her influence was subtle enough to excuse. She spoke for me in conversations where I was present, rephrasing my thoughts with a softness that made me sound uncertain. She volunteered information I hadn't offered, always framed as concern. She remembered details about people in positions of authority and used them carefully, like tools she kept polished in her pocket. I told myself I was imagining patterns that weren't there. That was easier than admitting the truth. My sister wasn't impulsive. She was deliberate. She had a way of speaking that put people at ease, especially those who expected gratitude and respect. Teachers, managers, advisors, even attorneys leaned toward her without realizing it. She asked questions that sounded thoughtful and made suggestions that felt collaborative, but always guided the outcome in her favor. If I disagreed, she never contradicted me directly. She simply reframed the disagreement later privately in language that cast her as reasonable and me as reactive. Authority trusted her instinctively. I was seen as capable but distant, competent but difficult to read. The contrast mattered more than I understood at the time. Our careers pulled us in opposite directions, and that difference widened the gap between us. I chose work that allowed me to operate quietly without oversight or applause. Independence mattered to me more than recognition. My sister chose visibility. She gravitated toward environments where proximity to power was currency, where language could be leveraged, where reputations were shaped long before facts were examined. My father praised her choices openly. He called her work serious, respectable, aligned with the family's values. When he spoke about my path, his compliments were vague. "You're doing fine. You always land on your feet." I heard what he didn't say. "You don't represent us." The first time I realized my sister was willing to cross a line, I didn't recognize it as betrayal. I thought it was misunderstanding. I had shared something with her privately, something that affected my work and my finances. She listened, nodded, asked careful questions. Days later, a third party contacted me concerned. They knew details I had never disclosed to them. When I asked my sister about it, she looked genuinely surprised. "I was worried about you," she said. "I didn't want it to become a problem." She spoke softly, almost apologetically. The damage was already done, but it was framed as help. Any attempt to protest made me look ungrateful. I tried to explain this to my father once. Not emotionally, not accusingly. I chose my words with care and laid out the facts as plainly as I could. He listened, arms crossed, expression neutral. When I finished, he said I was reading too much into it. He told me my sister was only trying to support me, that I should be grateful to have family looking out for me. My sister sat quietly through that conversation. She didn't defend herself. She didn't argue. She let his authority seal the discussion. That was when I understood something important. Silence wasn't her weakness. It was her strategy. As the years passed, she became fluent in the language of contracts and risk. She absorbed legal terminology the way some people absorb gossip. Casually, thoroughly. She knew which words carried weight and which ones invited scrutiny. When she spoke about problems, she spoke about exposure. When she talked about solutions, she talked about protection. Once over coffee, she laughed and said it was amazing how easy it was to ruin someone legally if you knew where to push. She said it like an observation, not a threat. I remember feeling unsettled, then embarrassed for feeling that way. I told myself I was being dramatic. In the courtroom now, I watched her with new eyes. The confidence she wore wasn't bravado. It was familiarity. She had been preparing for rooms like this long before we ever stepped into one together. She knew how to sit, how to listen, how to wait. She whispered to her lawyer at one point, her voice low controlled. I didn't hear the words, but I recognized the cadence. It was the same tone she used when she believed she was guiding an outcome, not reacting to one. For years, I had assumed the family's power rested with my father. He was the figurehead, the decision-maker, the one whose approval mattered. I saw now how incomplete that picture had been. My sister didn't need to be in charge. She needed to influence the person who was. I thought back to the early signs I had dismissed. The way she would position herself near authority figures at gatherings. The way she volunteered to handle sensitive conversations. The way narratives seemed to settle around her version of events without challenge. None of it had been accidental. The judge asked another procedural question, and my sister responded without hesitation. Her answer was polished, confident, rooted in assumptions she had repeated often enough to believe. I realized then that certainty was her greatest vulnerability. She believed her version of events was the only one that mattered because it had always been the one that prevailed. I felt no urge to interrupt, no need to correct her. For the first time, I understood the value of letting someone commit fully to a story they couldn't sustain. As the hearing continued, I noticed the smallest detail. A phrase repeated in a filing then echoed in her response. It was language I recognized not from legal documents but from private conversations we had years ago. The realization settled quietly like a puzzle piece sliding into place. This wasn't a spontaneous attack. It wasn't even a reaction. It was the culmination of a strategy built over time, one that depended on my silence and her credibility. I leaned back in my chair and steadied my breathing. I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I was alert. The story my sister had learned to control was finally being told in a room that didn't belong to her. And for the first time I was ready to let it unfold. I still believed foolishly that whatever was happening could be contained. That if we spoke privately calmly like adults who shared blood and history, we could pull it back from the edge. I told myself families fought all the time. That public tension didn't have to mean public destruction. That illusion lasted until the night my father chose her side where everyone could see it. The event itself was harmless on the surface. A formal gathering tied to one of my father's professional commitments, the kind of evening built on polite smiles and careful conversation. People I'd known for years were there. Colleagues, advisors, friends of the family who had watched us grow up and assumed they understood us. I almost didn't go. Something in my chest felt tight when I read the invitation, but I convinced myself that avoiding it would look worse. My sister was already there when I arrived, dressed impeccably, moving through the room with practiced ease. She greeted me warmly, a touch to my arm, a smile that said, "We're fine, everything's fine." My father stood nearby, speaking with a small group, his posture formal, his expression unreadable. I noticed even then how many unfamiliar faces were present. People I hadn't expected. People with influence. I didn't understand until later that this wasn't coincidence. It was positioning. When my father finally addressed the room, his tone was measured, almost apologetic. He spoke about responsibility, about difficult decisions, about the burden of leadership and the pain of watching someone you love make choices that put everyone at risk. He never said my name at first. He didn't have to. Heads turned toward me anyway. I felt the shift before I heard it fully. The way the air thickened, the way conversations stilled just enough to listen. Then he said it, calmly, publicly. He framed it as concern, as necessity. He explained that certain steps were being taken to protect shared interests, that legal advice had been sought, that sometimes family matters had to be addressed formally when private efforts failed. My sister stood beside him, one hand lightly resting on his arm. She nodded at the right moments, her expression composed, sympathetic. If anyone questioned her role, they couldn't have said when. She looked like a daughter supporting her father through an unpleasant duty. No one asked for my response. No one turned to hear my side. The narrative settled instantly like dust after something heavy falls. I watched people I trusted absorb it without hesitation. I saw understanding in their faces, even relief. This made sense to them. It fit the version of me they had been given. I felt myself grow very still. When it ended, conversations resumed, but differently. Quieter around me. Politer. People who had once spoken freely now chose their words carefully, as if I were fragile or volatile. A few offered sympathetic looks. None asked questions. That was when I understood how quickly reputation could be rewritten when authority spoke first. I tried to pull my father aside before he could disappear into the crowd. I waited until he was alone, until the room had thinned just enough. I spoke quietly, evenly. I asked him why he thought this was necessary, why he had chosen to do it this way. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't apologize. He said he was acting on advice. He said it was for everyone's good. He said we could talk more later through proper channels. The phrase proper channels landed like a door closing. My sister joined us before I could respond. She didn't interrupt. She simply stood there, listening, her presence enough to change the tone. She looked at me with something that could have passed for regret if I hadn't known her better. "This isn't the time," she said softly. "We'll sort it out." It was the same line she had used for years, the one that postponed resolution until it no longer mattered. My father nodded, grateful for the rescue. The conversation ended without conclusion, just containment. I left early. In the car, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, replaying his words. Not the accusations themselves, but the certainty behind them. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't looked at me for confirmation. He had decided how this would be handled, and he had done it in the one place where I couldn't contradict him without looking exactly like what he had described. Within days, the consequences began to surface. Calls went unanswered, meetings were postponed. A colleague mentioned carefully that there were concerns circulating. The tone was always the same. Worry disguised as professionalism, distance disguised as caution. I understood then that the public moment hadn't been the attack. It had been the announcement. The confirmation came a week later in the form of an envelope waiting on my desk. Official, heavy, addressed in language that left no room for misunderstanding. I held it for a long moment before opening it, already knowing what it would contain. As I read, the words blurred and sharpened in equal measure. Legal framing, protective measures, allegations dressed as safeguards. My father's name appeared where I expected it. My sister's influence appeared everywhere else, woven into the phrasing, the urgency, the assumptions. I set the papers down and leaned back in my chair. There it was. The thing I had tried to avoid by staying quiet, by keeping my life separate, by believing distance could shield me. The family conflict I had swallowed for years had finally stepped into the open, carrying my name like a liability. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I sat there and listened to the silence of a room that no longer felt safe. Whatever chance there had been to walk this back had ended the moment my father spoke for me in front of everyone who mattered. From that point on, this was no longer about misunderstanding or reconciliation. It was about control. And for the first time, I knew with absolute clarity that they weren't preparing to help me. They were preparing to remove me. For a brief, foolish window of time, I told myself the worst had already happened. The public moment had passed. The damage was done. Whatever my father had needed to say in front of everyone, he had said it. I convinced myself that, ugly as it was, the storm might fade if I stayed quiet long enough. That belief ended the morning the letter arrived. It wasn't dramatic. No knock on the door, no confrontation. Just an envelope waiting where it didn't belong, thicker than a bill, heavier than ordinary mail. Certified. Return address from a law firm I recognized instantly, the kind whose name carried weight without needing explanation. I didn't open it right away. I stood there with my coat still on keys in my hand, staring at my own name typed in formal black letters. Seeing it like that felt strange, as if it belonged to someone else, someone already reduced to a case file. When I finally sat down and tore it open, the first thing I noticed was the language. Cold. Precise. Concerned in a way that stripped the word of all meaning. I was referred to by my full legal name, repeated again and again, as though saying it enough times would turn me into a problem that needed managing. The claims came quickly. Allegations framed as worries, accusations disguised as precautions. There were references to mismanagement, to risk exposure to actions that supposedly placed shared interests in jeopardy. It read like a diagnosis written by someone who had never met me, confident in their conclusions. Halfway down the page, I saw it. Not my father's voice, but my sister's. Certain phrases stood out, words she favored when she wanted to sound reasonable while closing every door. It was unmistakable once I knew how to look for it. The concern was hers. The urgency was hers. My father's name was there, but the fingerprints belonged to her. I turned the page, my pulse steady in a way that surprised me. This wasn't confusion. This was intent. Buried in the middle of the document were the real threats. Asset restrictions, mandatory disclosures, language that made it clear they weren't asking for cooperation. They were asserting control. The goal wasn't to resolve anything. It was to box me in so tightly that resistance would look reckless. I read it twice, then a third time. Each pass stripped away another layer of denial. This wasn't a warning. It was the opening move. I reached for my phone and called my father. It rang until it didn't. No voicemail, no explanation. I tried again, then stopped myself. I knew what silence meant in our family. It meant the decision had already been made. I sent my sister a short message. Nothing emotional, just a question. Her reply came hours later, formal and distant. She suggested I direct all communication through counsel. The words felt rehearsed, lifted straight from the letter itself. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I sat there and let the reality settle. The people who had once told me to trust them were now using the law to force my compliance. Not openly, not aggressively, but with enough pressure to make every move feel dangerous. Fear crept in quietly. Not panic, but calculation. What would happen if I ignored this? What would happen if I fought? What would happen if I complied? I understood then how these situations swallowed people whole. The sheer weight of it could make surrender feel like relief. But as I read the letter again, slower this time, something caught my attention. A claim made too broadly. An assumption stated as fact. A date that didn't align with my own records. It wasn't proof of anything yet, but it was wrong, and wrong mattered. I pulled out a folder I hadn't opened in years. Documents I kept because I had learned not to trust memory alone. I compared timelines. I checked names. The inconsistency remained small but undeniable. They were counting on me being overwhelmed. They were counting on me folding before I noticed. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. This was no longer about hurt feelings or family roles. This was about survival. About whether I would let someone else define my reality on paper. For the first time since the letter arrived, I felt something like resolve. I thought about calling friends, about explaining, about defending myself to anyone who would listen. I dismissed the urge immediately. I had learned that lesson the hard way. Explaining too early only fed the story already in motion. What I needed wasn't sympathy, it was structure. The thought of hiring a lawyer made my stomach tighten. It felt like crossing a line I had avoided my entire life. In my family, bringing in outsiders was an admission of failure. It meant things had gone too far. I had spent years trying to prove I could handle things on my own. But this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about protecting what I had built quietly, carefully, without their knowledge. I picked up the letter one last time and read the closing paragraph. Polite. Final. Signed with confidence. They believed I would be afraid enough to comply, that I would choose the path of least resistance, the one that kept everything tidy for them. I folded the papers and placed them back in the envelope. If they wanted to turn my life into a legal matter, then I would meet them there. Not emotionally, not impulsively, on terms they didn't expect. I reached for my phone again, this time scrolling past family names until I found the number I had been given months earlier and never thought I would use. I hesitated for only a moment before dialing. As the call connected, I glanced once more at the letter on my desk. The words no longer felt suffocating. They felt revealing. They had made one critical mistake. They assumed fear would make me careless. They didn't realize fear had finally made me pay attention. The office was smaller than I expected, tucked between a bakery and a travel agency, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. No marble lobby, no brass plaques, just a glass door with a name etched neatly at eye level. I paused before going in the letter from my family's lawyers, folded carefully in my bag like a weight I couldn't set down. For years I had told myself I didn't need help. That handling things quietly was a form of strength. Walking into that office felt like admitting I had been wrong, or worse, that I had finally accepted how far this had gone. The lawyer didn't rush me. He didn't offer sympathy or outrage. He shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from his desk, and waited while I took my coat off and settled in. The room smelled faintly of paper and coffee, ordinary and grounding. When I slid the letter toward him, he didn't reach for it immediately. He looked at me instead. "Tell me what you think this is about," he said. I surprised myself by answering without hesitation. I told him it wasn't about money, it wasn't about protection, it was about control. About my sister deciding I was a liability she could manage if she moved quickly enough. I spoke calmly, choosing my words with the same care I had learned to use around my family. He nodded once, then picked up the letter and began to read. The silence stretched. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He read the entire thing front to back, then flipped it over and scanned it again. When he finally set it down, his expression hadn't changed. "This is aggressive," he said. "But it's not as solid as they want you to believe." The tension I hadn't realized I was holding loosened slightly. He pointed to a paragraph halfway down the page, then another near the end. He asked about dates, about documents, about decisions made years earlier. His questions were precise, almost surgical. There was no drama in them, just curiosity sharpened by experience. "They're assuming a few things here," he said finally, "and assumptions are dangerous in court." He explained what the letter was designed to do, how the language was meant to intimidate, to force compliance before facts were examined. He said it was a common tactic when one side believed they controlled the narrative: pressure first, evidence later. "What they're counting on," he said, "is that you'll be too scared to slow this down." I told him about my sister, about the way she framed concern as authority, about how she spoke when she believed she was being reasonable. He listened without comment, then asked one question that caught me off guard. "Does she think you don't know something?" he asked. "Or does she think you don't have access to it?" The difference mattered. I hadn't considered it that way. He asked me to bring in anything I had from the period referenced in the letter: financial records, emails, agreements, anything, no matter how small. As he spoke, something in his tone shifted. Not urgency, focus. "There's a flaw here," he said, "a timeline issue they've glossed over. It may not look like much now, but if they keep pushing, it becomes a problem for them." I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself yet. Not hope. Clarity. He leaned back slightly and folded his hands. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "If we engage, this won't stay quiet. They're already committed. They'll escalate. That means more pressure, more exposure." I told him I understood. He laid out the options plainly. One path involved negotiating early, containing damage, keeping things private. It would require concessions. Silence. Acceptance of certain narratives. The other path involved defending, aggressively challenging assumptions, forcing disclosures. It would be slower, riskier, but it would take control away from anyone relying on intimidation. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the years I had spent staying out of the way, about the careful life I had built because I didn't trust my family not to interfere. I thought about the letter on my desk, the way it tried to shrink me into a problem that needed managing. "I'm not interested in preserving their version of the story," I said finally. "I'm interested in protecting the truth." He nodded as if he had expected nothing else. "Then we proceed carefully," he said, "and we don't correct them until they're fully committed to their position." He explained what that meant. Narrow responses, no unnecessary disclosures, letting their filings speak for themselves, allowing assumptions to harden into sworn statements. It wasn't about deception, it was about restraint. As the meeting wrapped up, he said something that stayed with me. "People who rely on control don't like uncertainty," he said. "They tend to overreach when they feel it slipping." When I left the office, the street felt brighter than it had before. Nothing had been fixed. No one had apologized. The letter still existed. The threat was still real. But for the first time since this began, I didn't feel alone inside it. That night I went through old files with new eyes, not defensively, curiously. I noticed details I had overlooked before because I hadn't known they mattered. Dates, signatures, small decisions that carried weight years later. My sister believed she understood how this would end because she always had before. She believed certainty was on her side. What she didn't know was that certainty cuts both ways. By the time I closed the last folder, I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't angry either. I was prepared. The next move was hers, and for once I was ready to let her make it. The first sign that my sister was losing patience came in the form of an email sent at 6:12 a.m., addressed not just to me, but copied to 3 people she knew would unsettle me. Her tone was polished, almost kind, but every sentence carried a warning disguised as concern. She wrote that the situation had become untenable, that outside advisors were now involved, that continuing to resist would only cause unnecessary damage to everyone. She ended by saying she hoped I would choose cooperation over pride. I forwarded it to my lawyer without replying. An hour later he called. "She's escalating," he said, "which means she's uncomfortable." I had expected fear to come with that realization. Instead, I felt a steady calm, the kind that comes when patterns finally reveal themselves. Over the next few days, the pressure arrived from multiple directions. A former colleague reached out with awkward small talk that veered too quickly into questions about my finances. A distant relative called to ask if everything was all right, her concern oddly specific. Even my bank flagged an inquiry that had been framed as routine due diligence, but carried my sister's unmistakable fingerprint. She wasn't attacking directly anymore. She was surrounding me. That was exactly what my lawyer had predicted. Control-minded people hate uncertainty, he reminded me during our next meeting. When they can't force a result, they try to narrow your world. We sat across from each other and the same quiet office documents spread neatly between us. He pointed to a timeline he had drafted, a clean, linear breakdown of events that contradicted the version my sister was pushing. "She's made a mistake," he said. "She's assuming this is about leverage." "It's not. It's about record." He explained that her filings relied heavily on implied authority, on the idea that she had always been the responsible one, the decision-maker, the protector of family interests. That narrative worked socially. It did not work legally. "She's also assuming you'll respond emotionally," he added. "That you'll rush to correct her, defend yourself, fill in gaps." I smiled despite myself. "I won't." "Good," he said, "because silence is doing more work than any argument could right now." The next move came faster than I expected. A formal notice arrived by courier, thick and expensive-looking, filled with language designed to intimidate. It referenced potential insolvency, reputational harm, and fiduciary concerns. It used phrases like imminent risk and urgent resolution. What it did not include was proof. I read it twice, then set it aside and made coffee. That afternoon, my lawyer sent a short response. 3 paragraphs. No emotion, no denial. Just a request for clarification on specific claims supported by dates and documentation. It was the kind of reply that looked harmless on the surface and devastating beneath it. Within 48 hours, my sister's attorney requested an extension. "That's the crack," my lawyer said when he told me. She didn't expect to be asked to slow down. While they scrambled, we kept working. We subpoenaed records quietly, cross-checked filings, built a clean, factual version of events that didn't rely on interpretation. Each piece fit neatly into place, revealing not just inconsistencies, but intent. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about sidelining me. It was about preemptive control. My sister had moved first because she believed she had to. Something was coming and she wanted to be positioned above it. The realization shifted everything. "You don't start a fire unless you're trying to burn evidence," my lawyer said. The tension finally broke during a meeting she insisted on having. Neutral location, neutral mediator. She arrived dressed in soft colors, carrying herself with practiced calm, the kind that suggested reasonableness. She smiled when she saw me as if we were meeting for lunch. "I wish it hadn't come to this," she said, folding her hands neatly on the table. "So do I replied. She spoke for a long time. About family, about responsibility, about how hard she'd worked to keep things together. Her words were careful, rehearsed. She framed herself as burdened but willing to forgive. Then she leaned in slightly. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said quietly, "and you're going to lose more than you think." It was the closest she came to honesty. When it was my turn, I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I simply slid a single document across the table. Her eyes flicked down, then back up. "What is this?" she asked. "A date," I said. "One you overlooked." She frowned, scanning the page. I watched the moment she realized what it meant. The controlled expression slipped just for a second. Enough. The mediator noticed. We ended the meeting shortly after. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. The following morning my lawyer called with an edge of satisfaction he hadn't allowed himself before. They filed an amended motion, he said. And they contradicted themselves. He explained how her team had tried to correct earlier assumptions without acknowledging them. In doing so, they created a discrepancy that couldn't be explained away. She's now locked into two incompatible positions, he said. Either one damages her credibility. The walls were closing in, and she knew it. Her next attempt was bolder. A public filing clearly intended to shape perception. It painted me as uncooperative, evasive, difficult. It leaned heavily on character rather than fact. The problem was that it came too late. By then, the record was already set. She's panicking, my lawyer said simply. The day before the hearing, I received a text from a number I hadn't seen in years. We should talk. This has gone too far. I stared at the screen for a long moment before deleting it. By the time we walked into the courthouse, the atmosphere had shifted. The confidence she once carried was gone, replaced by something brittle. Her lawyer avoided eye contact. The judge skimmed the file with visible irritation. When proceedings began, it was clear this was no longer about family. It was about misuse of process. As arguments unfolded, I watched my sister realize piece by piece that control had slipped from her grasp, that her certainty had become evidence against her, that the story she relied on no longer held. She looked at me once across the room, eyes sharp with disbelief. For the first time, she understood. This wasn't about winning. It was about exposure. And she had brought the spotlight herself. The courthouse smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, a sterile mix that made everything feel colder than it was. By the time Chapter 8 began, I had learned that courtrooms have their own kind of weather. Pressure shifts, invisible fronts moving through the air. You can feel when something is about to break. My sister arrived late on purpose. She always did that when she wanted control of the room. Not rushed, not apologetic. Calm, measured. As if everyone else's time existed to orbit hers. She walked in with her lawyer a step behind her heels, clicking softly against the marble floor, chin lifted just enough to signal confidence. Our father wasn't with her this time. That absence spoke louder than his presence ever had. I sat at the defense table with my attorney hands folded back, straight eyes forward. I didn't look at her when she took her seat. I didn't need to. I could feel her attention like a heat source aimed at the side of my face. When the judge entered the room, rose, and settled again, the scrape of chairs echoing like a warning bell. The hearing began with procedural updates. Dry language, dates, references to filings. The judge's tone was clipped, already irritated. He had read the briefs. He knew something was off. My sister's attorney stood first. He spoke smoothly, confidently, repeating the narrative they had been pushing from the beginning. Financial concern, family obligation, my supposed refusal to cooperate. He framed their actions as reluctant but necessary. I had heard it all before. What changed this time was the judge's expression. He leaned back slightly, fingers, steepled eyes narrowing as the lawyer spoke. He didn't interrupt. That was never a good sign. When it was my attorney's turn, he didn't stand immediately. He waited a beat longer than necessary, letting the silence stretch. Then he rose and walked to the podium with a calm that felt deliberate. "Your Honor," he said, "before we address intent, we need to address sequence." He laid out the timeline slowly. Dates, actions, contradictions. He didn't accuse. He didn't editorialize. He simply placed facts in order and let them speak. I watched my sister's posture change, a subtle shift. Her shoulders tightened, her jaw set. The judge leaned forward. "Counsel?" The judge said to my sister's attorney, "Can you explain why your client filed this motion before requesting the records she now claims are essential?" There it was. The question she hadn't expected. Her lawyer hesitated, just long enough. He offered an explanation that relied on urgency. Risk. Protective action. The judge frowned. Urgency does not excuse procedural abuse, he said flatly, especially when the risk appears hypothetical. He turned his gaze to my sister for the first time. Ms. Carter, he said, using her married name. Were you aware that this filing would trigger immediate reputational and financial consequences for the defendant? She straightened. I was advised that it was a necessary step, she replied carefully. That's not what I asked. The judge said, I asked whether you were aware of the consequences. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her lawyer stepped in too quickly. Your Honor. The judge raised a hand. No, he said. I want to hear from her. The room went very still. Yes, my sister said finally. I was aware. And you proceeded anyway, the judge said. Yes. Even though no immediate harm had been demonstrated. He continued. She hesitated. I believed harm was imminent. Belief is not evidence, the judge said sharply. And court is not a belief-based system. Her composure cracked just a little. A flicker of irritation crossed her face before she masked it. My attorney seized the moment. Your Honor, he said, may we submit Exhibit 12? The clerk took the document. The judge scanned it, brow furrowing. This was the internal email chain my sister didn't know existed. The one that showed her coordinating the filing before any investigation, before any attempt at resolution. Language that spoke of leverage, of pressure, of forcing compliance. The judge looked up slowly. Ms. Carter, he said this email suggests your objective was not protection, but control. My sister's eyes snapped to me. For a brief moment the mask slipped entirely. What showed beneath wasn't anger. It was fear. That email is being taken out of context, her lawyer said quickly. Then provide the context, the judge replied. Because from where I'm sitting, it reads like a strategy to coerce, not resolve. He turned to my attorney. Counsel, he said, what remedy are you seeking? My attorney didn't hesitate. Dismissal with prejudice, he said, and sanctions for abuse of process. The word sanctions landed hard. My sister's lawyer stiffened. Your Honor, that would be excessive. The judge's gaze hardened. What's excessive, he said, is using this court as a weapon in a family dispute. He looked back at my sister. You understand that filing something like this is not a negotiation tactic, he said. It carries real consequences. She nodded, but her eyes were glassy now. I was trying to protect what was ours, she said. The judge tilted his head. From whom, he asked. She didn't answer. Silence filled the room again, heavier this time. The judge exhaled slowly. I'm ordering a temporary stay, he said. Effective immediately. No further filings without this court's permission. My sister's lawyer leaned toward her, whispering urgently. She barely reacted. And I am scheduling a sanctions hearing. The judge continued to determine whether this court has been misused. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Adjourned. As people began to rise, murmurs rippled through the room. My sister remained seated, staring straight ahead. She didn't look at me. Outside the courtroom, my attorney turned to me. That he said quietly was the first fracture. I nodded. My hands were steady, my breath even. Across the hallway, my sister finally stood. She walked toward me, stopping a few feet away. This isn't over, she said, voice low. I met her gaze. I know I replied. That's the difference. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something else. Then she thought better of it and turned away. I watched her leave, heels striking the floor with less confidence than before. For the first time, she wasn't leading the story. She was reacting to it. and the judge's question still hung in the air unanswered, echoing louder than any accusation. From that moment on, everything shifted. The days after the hearing moved with an unnatural slowness, like the air itself had thickened. Word spread quietly, not through headlines but through phone calls that ended too quickly, through meetings that were suddenly postponed, through invitations that evaporated without explanation. My sister had always thrived in rooms where people whispered. Now she was discovering what it felt like to be the subject instead of the conductor. The sanctions hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. 3 weeks was an eternity and a blink at the same time. My attorney warned me that this was the most dangerous stretch, not because of what was happening in court, but because of what could happen outside of it. People who lose control don't always retreat. Sometimes they lunge. I took his warning seriously. I tightened everything: access, communication, records. I stopped answering unknown numbers. I rerouted sensitive correspondence. I spoke less and listened more. Every instinct told me that my sister wasn't finished trying to shape the narrative. She had lived her entire life believing that if she spoke first and confidently enough, the world would rearrange itself around her version of events. But something had changed. 2 days after the hearing, I received a call from someone I hadn't heard from in years. An old family friend. The kind who never called unless there was something to gain or something to lose. "I just wanted to check in," she said, her voice overly warm. "Things seem tense." I thanked her and kept my answers vague. An hour later, my attorney forwarded me an email she had sent him instead, asking whether I was open to a private resolution before things became public. They were testing exits. The next sign came from a different direction. A reporter reached out. Not a tabloid. A business publication. Polite. Careful. He said he was working on a piece about misuse of civil courts and wondered if I'd be willing to comment on record. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The fact that he was asking meant the story had already escaped my sister's grip. At home, I found myself thinking about moments I hadn't revisited in years. Family dinners where my sister spoke for me before I opened my mouth. Decisions that were framed as collective but somehow always aligned with her interests. The subtle erosion of autonomy that never looked like abuse until you stepped far enough away to see the pattern. What unsettled me wasn't anger. It was clarity. I realized how carefully she had curated her role. The responsible one. The fixer. The daughter who stayed close, who managed expectations, who kept our father calm, and our mother convinced that everything was under control. I had been cast as the variable. The risk. The one whose independence needed supervision. The court had disrupted that dynamic. The following week, my sister filed a motion of her own, not aggressive, not defensive, procedural. A request to narrow the scope of the sanctions hearing, to limit discovery, to protect third parties from unnecessary exposure. My attorney read it once, then laughed. "She's trying to close the door after opening every window," he said. We responded with a simple objection, denied 2 days later. The judge's patience was gone. That was when my sister finally called me directly. It was late, nearly 10. I stared at the screen while it rang my name, glowing faintly in the dark. I almost didn't answer. But I did. "This has gone far enough," she said without preamble. No greeting. No pretense. "I don't agree," I replied. She exhaled sharply. "You always do this. You push until everything breaks and then you act surprised." I leaned back against the counter, the kitchen quiet around me. "What exactly is breaking?" I asked. "Our family," she snapped. "Our reputation. Everything Dad built." "You filed against me in open court," I said calmly. "What did you think would happen?" She went silent for a beat. "I thought you'd fold," she said finally, "like you always do." There it was, the truth stripped of varnish. "I'm not folding," I said. And you don't get to decide when this stops. Her voice softened, pivoting. You don't understand what this is doing to Mom. I closed my eyes. You involved her, I said. Not me. You're enjoying this, she accused, watching me scramble. I opened my eyes again. No, I said. I'm watching you face consequences. The line went dead. I stood there for a long time after phone still in my hand, heart steady. I had expected that call to hurt, to reopen something raw. Instead, it felt like a door closing. The sanctions hearing arrived quietly. No cameras, no spectators, just a smaller courtroom, a heavier atmosphere. My sister looked different that day, tired, pulled tight. Her confidence now felt forced, like a performance she hadn't rehearsed enough. The judge wasted no time. He recited the findings methodically, the premature filing, the lack of evidentiary basis, the internal communications that suggested intent to pressure rather than resolve. My sister's lawyer tried to argue mitigation, emotional stress, familial complexity. The judge listened, then shook his head. This court does not exist to settle power struggles, he said. It exists to adjudicate facts. He imposed sanctions, not symbolic ones, financial, procedural. A formal reprimand entered into the record. My sister stared straight ahead as the gavel came down. When it was over, she didn't approach me. She didn't speak. She gathered her things and left with her lawyer's shoulders rigid. Outside, my attorney turned to me. This will follow her, he said, in ways she doesn't fully grasp yet. I nodded. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. That night, I sat alone in my living room, the city lights blinking through the window. I thought about how easily the story could have gone differently if I had reacted the way she expected. If I had panicked, apologized, tried to negotiate my dignity back. Instead, I had let the process do what it was designed to do. The conflict wasn't over. Not entirely. But the balance had shifted. For the first time, my sister wasn't writing the ending, and neither was I. The truth was, the fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in ripples, quiet and persistent, spreading outward from the courtroom into places my sister had always assumed were insulated from consequence. The first ripple hit her work. I heard about it from someone else, not her. A former colleague of mine, now working at a firm that partnered occasionally with my sister's company, called under the pretense of catching up. We exchanged pleasantries for less than a minute before she lowered her voice. They're reviewing internal risk exposure, she said. Anything that could reflect poorly on leadership. I didn't ask what prompted the review. I didn't need to. In industries built on trust, the word sanctions has a long shadow. The second ripple reached our parents. My mother called me one afternoon, her voice brittle and uncertain, as if she were walking on glass. I don't understand how this happened, she said. Your sister is so careful. I sat at my desk, looking out the window at a street I had chosen myself in a city she had once dismissed as temporary. She wasn't careful, I said gently. She was confident. My mother sighed. Your father hasn't been sleeping. That wasn't an apology. It wasn't even acknowledgement. It was an attempt to reframe what had happened as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a deliberate choice. I didn't take the bait. I hope he gets some rest, I said. After we hung up, I felt a familiar pressure in my chest, the old instinct to manage everyone else's emotions before tending to my own. It rose automatically like muscle memory. Then it passed. I let it. The third ripple was the one my sister never saw coming. A routine audit, triggered by the sanctions, expanded by the inconsistencies uncovered during discovery. It wasn't accusatory, not yet. It was framed as standard procedure. But procedures have a way of leading places. My attorney called me as soon as he heard. They're asking questions she can't answer cleanly, he said. Not about you, about her. That was when I understood the full cost of what she had done. She hadn't just tried to control me, she had exposed herself. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a shift in how people spoke to her. I saw it at a distance through third-party accounts and the occasional unavoidable interaction. Invitations phrased more formally. Conversations that stayed on the surface. Eyes that lingered a second longer than before, assessing rather than admiring. Power doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes. I ran into her once unexpectedly at a charity event we both still attended out of obligation. The room was crowded, the air thick with perfume and polite laughter. She spotted me across the floor and froze. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. She approached first, smile already in place. "You look well," she said. "So do you," I replied. We stood there, surrounded by people who pretended not to notice the tension humming between us. "I never wanted it to go this far," she said quietly. I studied her face, the careful makeup, the familiar tilt of her head when she was asking for something without admitting it. "You went as far as you needed to," I said. "It just didn't end where you planned." Her smile tightened. "You could still help fix this," she said. A statement. Something to soften the narrative. There it was. Even now, she believed resolution meant compliance. "I'm not fixing anything," I said calmly. "I'm done participating." Her eyes flashed, then dulled. "You're really going to let this define us?" she asked. "No," I said. "You already did." I walked away before she could respond. That night, I thought about the version of myself she remembered, the one who smoothed over conflict, who absorbed discomfort to keep the peace, who believed that family dynamics were immutable, that certain roles were assigned at birth and never revised. That version of me would have written the statement, taken the call, agreed to help manage appearances. She was counting on that person. What my sister never understood was that I didn't change overnight. I had been changing quietly for years. Each dismissed opinion, each overridden decision, each moment I was told to trust her judgment over my own. The court hadn't transformed me. It had simply revealed who I already was. The audit results came back a month later. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to warrant oversight, enough to introduce accountability into a system that had relied too heavily on deference. My sister called me again after that. This time I didn't answer. I didn't block her. I didn't send a message. I let the call ring out, the sound echoing through my apartment until it stopped on its own. The silence felt intentional, earned. A few days later, I received a letter, handwritten, short. "I hope one day you understand why I did what I did." I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Understanding wasn't the problem. Acceptance was. The final ripple came quietly, almost anticlimactically. A notice from the court. The matter officially closed. No further action pending. The language was dry, administrative, devoid of emotion. I read it once, then closed the file. There was no celebration, no dramatic release, just a deep, steady breath. I went for a walk that evening through streets I had come to love, past places that held no history except the ones I chose to make. The city moved around me, indifferent and alive. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing for impact. I wasn't waiting for the next move. The story had moved beyond reaction. It had settled into consequence. And as I turned the corner toward home, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't relieved that my sister had lost control. I was relieved that I had finally taken mine. The silence that followed felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into a room after the machinery has been shut off. No new filings, no calls from lawyers, no quiet warnings passed through intermediaries. Just days that unfolded without my sister's shadow stretching across them. It took time to trust that quiet. I noticed it in small ways. The way I slept through the night without jolting awake. The way I read emails without scanning for hidden threats. The way my phone became a tool again instead of a source of dread. That was when the reflection began. I had spent so many years responding to my family that I hadn't fully understood how much of my life had been shaped by reaction. Every choice framed against expectation. Every success quietly minimized so it wouldn't provoke discomfort. Every boundary softened so it wouldn't look like defiance. Winning in court didn't undo that conditioning. It only exposed it. I met my attorney for lunch a week after the case formally closed. No documents this time, no timelines. Just coffee and sunlight filtering through the windows of a quiet restaurant. "You did well," he said almost casually. "I didn't feel like I was doing anything," I replied. "I just stopped." He smiled. "That's usually the hardest part." He told me he'd seen this pattern before. Family disputes that weren't really about money or control, but about hierarchy. About someone refusing to stay in the place they were assigned. When that happens, he said the system panics. I thought about my sister. About how certain she had always been. How she had spoken with authority even when she was wrong. How easily others deferred to her certainty, because it was easier than questioning it. That certainty had been her currency. And now, it was devalued. I left lunch feeling lighter but not triumphant. What I felt was closer to clarity. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that settles. A few days later, I received an invitation to a family gathering. A neutral one. No host named. Just a date, a location, and a message that said it would be good for everyone to reconnect. I stared at the screen for a long time. In the past, I would have gone. I would have prepared myself emotionally rehearsed conversations, anticipated subtle jabs and carefully worded concern. I would have left exhausted, wondering why I felt smaller every time I tried to belong. This time I declined. No explanation, no apology, just a polite refusal. The reaction was immediate. My mother called, then texted. My father left a voicemail that tried to sound reasonable and failed. My sister said nothing at all. That silence told me everything. They were waiting for me to step back into the old shape. I didn't. Instead, I took a weekend trip alone. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere no one knew my last name. I walked along unfamiliar streets, ate meals without rushing, sat with my thoughts, without editing them for anyone else's comfort. I realized how much energy I had spent managing perception. Not just theirs, but mine. Telling myself stories about duty, about keeping peace, about being the reasonable one. Peace that requires your silence is not peace. It's compliance. On the last day of the trip, I wrote something down in a notebook I had carried with me but rarely used. It wasn't a plan or a list or a strategy. It was a sentence. I am allowed to exist without permission. I didn't show it to anyone. I didn't need to. When I returned home, life didn't suddenly transform. There were still emails, still work, still relationships that required care and effort. But something fundamental had shifted. I started making decisions without running them through the filter of how they would be received. I spoke more plainly. I said no without cushioning it. I let people sit with their discomfort instead of rushing to absorb it for them. Some relationships adjusted. Others fell away. I accepted both outcomes. My sister reached out one final time weeks later. Not with demands, not with threats. Just a message that said she hoped we could talk someday without lawyers or judges involved. I read it carefully. Then I closed the app. Maybe someday we would talk. Maybe we wouldn't. What mattered was that I no longer felt obligated to decide on her timeline. The version of me she remembered needed resolution to feel whole, needed acknowledgement, needed reconciliation to validate the pain. The version of me standing here didn't. I had learned something the hard way, but the lesson was clear. You don't heal by winning. You heal by stepping out of the arena entirely. On a quiet evening not long after, I stood by my window and watched the city lights flicker on one by one. Each window held a separate life, a separate story unfolding without reference to mine. For the first time, I felt like one of them. Not defined by conflict, not shaped by resistance. Just present. The case was over. The family narrative had fractured. The roles had been disrupted, and in the space that followed, something unexpected had taken root. Not revenge, not forgiveness, but freedom. I turned away from the window, shut off the lights, and let the quiet settle in around me. This time, I welcomed it. The last thing I expected after everything settled was how ordinary life would feel again. No dramatic music, no closing argument echoing in my head. Just mornings that began quietly and evenings that ended without tension pressing on my chest. For years I had believed that freedom would feel loud, victorious, obvious. Instead, it arrived softly. It showed up the first time I made a decision without explaining it to anyone. The first time I declined an invitation and didn't replay the conversation afterward, wondering how it would be interpreted. The first time my phone stayed silent for days, and I didn't feel the urge to fill that silence with reassurance. I realized then how deeply I had been trained to respond instead of choose. My father didn't call again after that last voicemail. Not to apologize, not to argue. The absence felt deliberate, like he was waiting for me to blink first. My sister stayed away entirely, which told me more than any message ever could. Control once lost rarely comes back disguised as kindness, and I was done chasing closure. What surprised me most was how little I wanted revenge now that I no longer needed validation. For a long time, I thought justice meant watching them admit they were wrong. That accountability required a public reckoning, a confession, some dramatic moment where the truth landed hard enough to be undeniable. But real justice didn't look like that. It looked like autonomy. It looked like waking up without rehearsing conversations that might never happen. It looked like trusting my own judgment without checking it against old family hierarchies. It looked like choosing peace without asking permission from the people who benefited from my unrest. The court gave me my name back. Life gave me something better, my sense of self. I thought about the version of me who walked into that courthouse months ago, bracing for humiliation, convinced that standing up for myself would cost me everything. I wish I could tell her that the cost of staying silent was far higher, that the fear she carried wasn't weakness, but awareness, that the strength she doubted herself capable of had been there all along, waiting for her to stop shrinking. Families like mine don't collapse overnight. They fracture slowly through small betrayals disguised as concern, through decisions made on your behalf, through narratives written about you while you're still in the room. It takes courage to see that pattern clearly. It takes even more courage to step out of it. I didn't leave my family behind in anger. I left in clarity. There is a difference. Sometimes people ask if I regret how far things went. If I wish I had handled it privately, quietly spared everyone the fallout. They ask as if dignity is something you negotiate for instead of something you claim. I don't regret defending myself. I regret how long I believed I didn't deserve to. What I learned more than anything is that power doesn't always shout. Often it whispers through expectations, obligations, and carefully managed roles. And the moment you stop playing your part, the whole performance falters. That doesn't make you cruel. It makes you honest. Today, my life is smaller in some ways. Fewer gatherings, fewer obligatory relationships. But it is also fuller, truer, built on consent instead of pressure, on choice instead of duty. I don't know if my sister will ever understand that. I don't know if my parents will ever see the difference between family and control. And I no longer need them to. The story they told about me has finally lost its power, and I get to write the next chapter myself. If you've listened this far, I want to pause here for a moment. Stories like this don't exist in isolation. They resonate because so many people carry versions of them quietly for years without ever saying a word. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, I'd really like to hear about it. You don't have to share details if you don't want to. Even a few words about how it made you feel can matter more than you think. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from today, or what part of the story stayed with you the most. Reading your thoughts reminds me that none of us are as alone in these experiences as we sometimes believe. If you'd like to hear more stories about family boundaries betrayal and the quiet kind of justice that changes a life, I hope you'll stay with the channel. Subscribing is a simple way to support these stories and make sure you don't miss the next one. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And wherever you are right now, I hope you choose yourself a little more boldly than you did yesterday.